Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm Robert Baylor, Director of Communications at NUCA. Welcome to our latest webinar. First, before we begin, some webinar housekeeping. Today's webinar will be recorded, and a copy of the recording will be provided to all registrants and attendees. It will also be available in the next few days on NUCA's YouTube channel, which can be accessed via nuca.com. Now about your WebEx Meetings webinar screen. There are two buttons on the lower right-hand side of your screen titled Participants and Chat. Clicking on Participants gives you a list of webinar attendees. You can chat amongst each other, or you can send the host questions or messages. All participants are muted upon entry. Phone participants can use *6 to mute themselves. Questions will be asked at the end of the webinar. To ask a question, you could submit a written question at any time using the chat feature, and I will read those written questions to our presenters at the conclusion of his presentation. Now let's get started. First, thank you for your time today, and thank you for participating in this year's summit. We're going to hear from NUCA's own lobbying staff in a minute about the basics of how Congress works, the all-important committee process, and how your time spent at Summit can lead to your own lawmakers casting the right vote for the industry and your business. I'm joined by our NUCA lobbyist, Zach Perconti. Each day, he talks to the members of Congress, their staff, and the committee staff handling our issues in both chambers. Our lobbying team needs your help at Summit to get our industry's goals across to lawmakers. Remember, you're not junior lawmakers, you're something better. You are experts who can tell the story of your local infrastructure to lawmakers. Thanks again for joining us today. Zach, I turn the webinar over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Bob. Thank you for joining us for our little civics refresher. Can I get the first slide, please? So thanks for joining us for our civics refresher. Today, like Bob said, we're going to go over a few basic details about how Congress works, what areas are of interest to us here at NUCA and in the industry, and how you can use that knowledge to carry out more effective advocacy on behalf of you, your business, and NUCA members as a whole. Let's just dive right into it and talk a bit about the legislative process. So if I can get the first slide, please. This is going to be a bit of a Schoolhouse Rock type thing, bit of a blast from the past for a lot of us. But you'd be surprised at, once you dive into it, how important knowing how this works really is to effective advocacy. So just to refresh everyone's memory on how this works, legislation begins when a member drafts the bill. Sometimes that language comes from the member themselves, sometimes it comes from staff, sometimes it comes from an interest group that has a specific policy proposal, be that a think tank, a trade association, what have you. It begins with the legislative language. In both chambers, the first step for that language happens at the committee level, and often even at the subcommittee level. That bill, when it's introduced at the committee, it needs to go through the markup process most of the time, not always, but in most instances, and particularly for many of our bills, the first step is when the committee meets, discusses, amends, and votes on the bill. That is a very important thing to know when it comes to talking to your members of Congress, and we'll get into why that matters in a little bit. But once that bill clears committee, the next step is floor debate. It moves on to the full chamber. And the same thing kind of happens again. There's not really a hearing process, but there is a formal debate process. The bill goes through an opportunity to have amendments voted on, change the bill, and it'll go to a vote. A bill will generally only go to a vote in a chamber if the leadership knows that it's going to pass. It's very rare for a bill that is supported by leadership to go to the floor and be voted down. Many folks will remember a couple of years ago, the very famous vote that Senator McCain gave on a proposal to amend the Affordable Care Act. That is a very unusual moment. The reason that moment, that thumbs down that he gave on the floor is a historic moment in the chamber is because frankly, that doesn't happen very often. There are very few times in which when a bill comes up for a vote, it's going to fail. So why is that important to know? Well, if a bill is not supported by leadership or the right people in Congress, it's never going to come up for a vote. That is by far and away the most common way that a piece of legislation dies. And that can happen at the committee process, that can happen on the floor, but most legislation that's introduced in Congress never even gets a committee hearing. And that's very important. That's part of the reason that our advocacy work is important, is we want to do our job to help shepherd legislation through the legislative process. So if a bill does pass a chamber, and for our purposes, we'll talk about the House first, it then needs to move on to the other one, and the whole process repeats. Typically, what will happen in this instance is the bill does need to be introduced again by a member of the Senate. Sometimes those bills are introduced in tandem with the House bill. Sometimes the bill will be passed through the chamber. A separate bill that's a similar idea will be working through the Senate, or sometimes it'll pass the chamber, they'll find an advocate in the Senate, and they'll introduce something there. It does vary a little bit based on the specific type of bill, but for our purposes, all we really need to know is that the bill is going to have two numbers, a House number and a Senate number, and the processes for both of them are independent yet intrinsically tied. They have to pass both chambers, so the whole process has to repeat, right? So when the bill is passed in the House, it's got to wait for the Senate to go through the whole thing, committee vote, floor vote. Assuming that they've passed identical legislation, that moves on to the White House. If the bill is at all different, even if that difference is just punctuation, it's got to go to a conference committee. The conference committee is made up of members of both chambers, reconciles any differences between the versions of the bill. Both chambers then have to vote again to approve it, and then it moves on to the White House. Now, very frequently, what you'll see to avoid that cumbersome process is one chamber, generally the House, will try to vote on language that has already made it through the other one to streamline the process. The flow chart on your screen gives probably the most basic overview of the process. Once you really start to dive in on this, you'll learn that there is a lot of minutia and procedural quirks and various different carve-outs and caveats that do apply to this whole process. And frankly, that's why both chambers of Congress employ people whose entire job it is to know the ins and outs of the legislative procedure. For our purposes as advocates, this is essentially all we really need to worry about. Now, there is one other really important process that we do have to concern ourselves with, though, and if I can get the next slide, we'll go into that. And that is the appropriations process. Appropriations is part of the legislative process, but it's also not. It is appropriations bills are separate and distinct from regular pieces of legislation that we generally tend to concern ourselves with. So if you look at your screen, you'll see a flow chart that does convey how the process works. At the beginning of the year, from July through February, the executive branch will draw up a proposal that they'll submit to Congress. Congress gets that proposal and they say, hey, thanks, and then they pretty much just toss it on a pile. The executive branch does not actually have any formal role in the appropriations process. All of the actual language has to come from Congress. And what will happen over the course of the appropriations process is you'll see a bunch of different bills that each cover the funding for a handful of federal departments and programs that at the end of the day will either be passed individually or all bundled together. So if they're all passed in one big bundle, that's called an omnibus bill. If they're passed in multiple smaller bundles, that's called a minibus bill. If you think back last December to the COVID relief bill that everybody talked about, recall that a lot of folks were looking at that bill and a common talking point was, this isn't really a COVID relief bill because we're giving $6 billion in foreign aid. We're spending $300 million on this other program. What does that have to do with COVID? That was an appropriations bill that COVID relief was tacked onto as a funding measure. So why is that important? Well, a lot of the stuff that we care about will often find itself attached to these appropriations bills moving through the process, including anything that is done through the reconciliation process, which is that nifty, or not so nifty, depending on how you think about it, procedural trick that allows Congress in the Senate to pass bills through on a 50-vote threshold, meaning it's not subject to the filibuster. We'll get into that a little more in a bit. But while we're talking about appropriations, there is one other important thing I do want to mention, and that is the earmarks process. So earmarks have been recently reintroduced. This was primarily done at the urging of House and Senate Democrats working on transportation and infrastructure issues. And the secret about earmarks is, yeah, they have a bad reputation, but they actually do play an important role both in the political process and in the appropriations process for political projects or infrastructure projects and other projects that might not necessarily get the same sort of attention that they would if folks were required to go through the normal appropriations process or spend political capital to get passed. Oftentimes appropriations projects that go through the earmarks process aren't necessarily the most high profile or politically attractive. They're things that might ordinarily slip under the radar. And they're often instances of very small, targeted, district level concerns that have gone unaddressed for a whole variety of reasons. One common example that I like to use is you might see an earmark that is a dollar amount as small as $100,000 to replace the roof of an elementary school. You may see a couple $1 million to widen the lanes of a highway in a member's district. And that might be a project that folks in the district have been asking for a long time, but for one reason or another, it's just never come up. So they're important from an infrastructure perspective because they do allow members to bring home something valuable to their district that might otherwise not get done. But on the other side of that's what makes them so important from a political perspective. Earmarks allow members to bring something of value back to their districts. And so that gives them an incentive to support a broader package that they might otherwise be on the fence about. That sort of horse trading isn't necessarily the most, it's not always the most appealing thing on the surface. It doesn't always necessarily look like it's the right way we should be doing things. But if I can be perfectly honest, the removal of the earmarks process did play a part in the growing partisanship in Congress over things like infrastructure. And so their reintroduction, particularly with the new process that we've seen be put into place by the agreement of both parties, which primarily pertains to ensuring that projects that are proposed aren't just wasting money. They do actually have local support and local funding involved in the process. That does contribute somewhat to reviving the bipartisan atmosphere around infrastructure that we actually are beginning to see in Washington. So if we can move on to the next slide. So I talked a little bit about the appropriations process just now. And the main reason I've done that, frankly, does play into the fact that it is increasingly becoming the way in which parties carry out partisan agendas through Congress. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but in order to understand why that is, we do have to talk a little bit about a modern filibuster. So the way we think of the filibuster today is relatively recent. It was not the case 30, 40 years ago. You know, everyone knows the classic movie, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, where he gets up and he holds the floor and he talks and talks and talks and talks and talks. Everyone's seen the videos of historic filibusters and even a few modern ones where the senator gets up on the floor and they talk 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 and they go on for hours and hours and hours and hold up business in the Senate. In the second half of the last century, that was becoming a more and more frequent event, and it was starting to hold up the legislative process as a whole and making it hard for the chamber to do anything. So that doesn't really happen as much anymore. Instead, what a procedural change was made known as dual tracking. Dual tracking means that essentially, instead of being required to get up and hold the floor and actually speak, a senator can make a motion that calls into question the existence of a 60-vote threshold to close debate. As a result, whatever was being discussed, the Senate proceeds under the assumption that that is being filibustered, and they move on to other business. So Senate business is then put on two tracks: everything else and the measure that was previously under debate. Now, that is a bit of a simplification, but what that means is in order for the Senate to pass anything, a 60-vote threshold is effectively needed in order to officially end debate and move on to votes. That is why a lot of the very controversial partisan measures that we've discussed previously and we've talked about as a concern in a lot of NUCA advocacy are not going to be possible without some sort of reform. Without that 60-vote threshold being reached, it's very difficult for a party to carry out partisan agendas in the Senate, with a few exceptions that we'll get to in a moment. That being said, and I do want to just touch briefly on this, while filibuster reform is stalled as a topic right now, it's not effectively dead. There is a chance that always looms large over the debate in Washington that some of the holdouts over some sort of filibuster reform, be it lowering the threshold for cloture or more likely a return to the talking filibuster of old, there's always the chance that that could come back if a party feels consistently frustrated in their attempt to carry out what they feel is a mandate for their agenda. So it's something we need to be aware of as advocates, but for now, we just need to know how it affects what the Senate can and can't easily do. There are a few notable exceptions to the filibuster that we do concern ourselves with. Some of these are more recent than others, but the three that I do want to talk about are the Congressional Review Act, nominations, and reconciliation. The first one, the Congressional Review Act, has become an increasing way in which Congress claws back some of their regulatory rulemaking authority that they've delegated to the executive branch. Essentially, what that allows them to do is, within a certain number of days of a final regulatory rulemaking being made, most recently, some changes that the Trump administration made to rules regarding methane emissions, Congress can vote to rescind those changes. That only requires a 50-vote threshold due to the way that the legislation is written. And we've seen that applied fairly increasingly over the last two administrations, including, as I said, with methane very recently. The second one, nominations, that's also a very recent change. Prior to the Obama administration, all nominations were subject to that 60-vote threshold to end debate or invoke cloture. During the Obama administration, that restriction was first lifted for lower court judges and then lifted for Supreme Court justices. And now, of course, that also does not apply to executive branch nominees, which is essentially why both the Trump administration and now the Biden administration have effectively been able to get in almost all of their people into the posts that they've put forward. The last one of those is the most important for us as advocates, and that's the reconciliation process. The appropriations process allows for a quirk, essentially, called reconciliation, that essentially allows budget bills to be changed and provide additional funding for certain programs. Congress can do this a couple of times a fiscal year. And as a result, reconciliation bills tend to be large, sweeping policy measures that Congress will pursue in order to fit through measures that are not bipartisan. It only requires a 50-vote threshold. The filibuster does not apply. And as a result, once the reconciliation process has been initiated, there's really not that much that the opposition party can do to stop it. Now, our saving grace for us as advocates, and something that we really need to know, is sometimes this can cut both ways. We can get funding for programs that we like. We can't really block funding for things we don't like, but it only applies to budget measures. Policy changes are not eligible under the reconciliation process. The gatekeeper of that is the Senate parliamentarian, one of the staffers I told you about earlier, whose entire job it is to know the ins and outs of legislative procedure. And if you'll recall, thinking back to the American Rescue Plan, the big COVID package that Democrats passed a couple months ago, they blocked the inclusion of the $15 minimum wage in that package because the Senate parliamentarian ruled that it was not a budget measure. Policy changes are not eligible under what is known as the Byrd Rule. That blocked their attempts to implement that. Similarly, some of the stuff that's been proposed in the American Jobs Plan, which is the name for the big Biden proposal that will make up the quote unquote infrastructure package, some of the things in there are not eligible under reconciliation. Notably, almost all of the changes included in the PRO Act, the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, the big pro-union bill that Democrats have been pushing both in the last Congress and now in this one, virtually everything in that bill is a policy change. So if Democrats choose to go through reconciliation, they can allocate as much funding for infrastructure funding as they choose, but all of those policy changes cannot be included in anything. Otherwise, if they choose to include them in the package, the threshold automatically rises to 60 votes as it is no longer a reconciliation bill. So I've talked a little bit about the process and how things work. Now I just want to get into who we focus on here at NUCA. So in the House of Representatives, there are three key committees that we focus our advocacy efforts on: Transportation and Infrastructure, Energy and Commerce, Education and Labor. Now, the first two of those, or the first and the last one of those, what they cover is kind of self-explanatory. Education and labor, they're responsible for labor policy and workforce development. There are some other things under their purview that they do handle, but for our concerns, that's really all that we go to them for. Transportation and infrastructure for NUCA, that is kind of our area of most concern. They handle most everything we do: surface transportation and infrastructure, most waterways, water infrastructure, a lot of stuff pertaining to regulation of the construction industry, the transportation regulatory agencies, and pipeline safety. Energy and commerce is where it gets a little weird. The Energy and Commerce Committee is responsible for handling energy policy. They're also responsible for handling broadband policy, and they're also responsible for handling drinking water policy. Why does that matter? Well, I'll talk a little bit more about why knowing these committees matters in a bit, but when we're going before these committees as advocates, we can go to transportation and infrastructure and talk about water policy as much as we want, but they can't really do anything to help us on the drinking water side because that's not their purview. Now, on the Senate side, things get even more confusing. The Senate issues are, if I get the next slide, the Senate committees tend to have a slightly broader jurisdiction that does not necessarily cover what the name might say. So if I can get the next slide, please. There are four that we focus on, but frankly, our work does touch on more than these four at times. The four of primary interest to us: Environment and Public Works, they handle all water infrastructure, which is a change from the House side. They also handle surface transportation, and they also handle, as the name would suggest, environmental policy. We tend to spend a lot of time talking to folks on EPW. That's probably our number one committee that we work with. But again, they don't handle everything that their name might suggest. Science, Commerce, and Transportation are responsible for a lot of the things that the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee handles. So they have broadband, they have the transportation regulatory agencies, and it's not in their name, but they also handle pipeline safety. Energy and natural resources, their purview of our issues is also fairly narrow. They handle national energy policy as well as fossil fuel regulations. And then health, education, labor, and pensions, they're the ones that we go to for labor policy and workforce development issues. So if I can get the next slide, I've talked to you guys for a while now. And I promise this will all make sense in a minute. But before I get into why all of this is important to know and how it can help our advocacy, real briefly, I just want to mention our 3 key regulatory agencies. We generally handle most of this stuff on our own. We don't really bring folks in for fly-ins with the regulators. But when it comes to the work that we focus on at NUCA, the ones that we do talk to Congress about a lot are the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration and the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration under the Department of Transportation, OSHA under DOL, and then the EPA when it comes to environmental policy and a lot of permitting issues. So how does all of this help you be an effective advocate? The number one thing that this knowledge can do to help you is to really just help you know your audience. Especially when we're in fly-in events like Washington Summit, don't try to hit everything on the fact sheets with every member of Congress. Instead, try to focus your conversation on areas of interest to the lawmaker, or if you were with the regulator. So for example, if you're meeting with a senator who only sits on energy and natural resources, try to focus your conversation on those issues. Try to talk about, well, look at what happens over the weekend. Try to talk about gas infrastructure. Try to talk about gas distribution. Try to talk about the work that your folks might be doing replacing gas lines. Talk about cybersecurity and how that affects your business. And talk about things that you might think that committee would be interested in. Don't spend 20 or 30 minutes talking about water infrastructure because, you know, it's always good to educate the member and their staff, and they'll always appreciate that, but they're going to try to match you with the staffer or brief the member on issues that remain in their purview. And even if the member is really interested and wants to learn more, there's not really as much they can do if they don't sit on that committee. That brings me to my next point. Know who those key members of Congress are. In particular, when we're talking about how to shepherd legislation through Congress, very little gets a committee hearing if the committee chair or subcommittee chair aren't sold on it. Sometimes you might be able to persuade something to get a little more play if the ranking member, so the member of the minority on the committee, is interested in the bill. But generally, unless the leadership that controls the chamber or controls the committee is on board, it's not going anywhere. So what we need to do is we target the committee chairs and the subcommittee chairs, as well as members of Congress who are heavily involved and invested in issues that are in our states and jurisdictions. We target them and try to advance our legislation through them, try to get their buy-in, ask them to co-sponsor the bill, ask them to tell us who we need to go talk to and try to get their support. We at NUCA will provide you all with briefing materials that help to identify these members and how you can effectively make your case to them. We've already provided the EDs with a list of all of the key members on those committees that I mentioned, as well as members of congressional leadership. And we'll continue to provide additional briefing materials to you all as the day of Summit approaches. Last but not least, it's helpful to just always keep that legislative process in mind when we're trying to talk about our agenda. When we go in and we talk about these issues at Summit, we try to tie it into a bill when we can. If we're talking about a bill, we want to know where it is in the process. How likely is that bill to make it through Congress? Who supports that bill? Where is the push for that bill coming from? Is it a bill that's coming from leadership that's working its way through the process, or is it something that a member in your state might have sponsored, but it's not getting any buy-in just now? This is also important to remember when we're talking about reconciliation bills or major bill packages that have been introduced by congressional leadership. We can, for example, sing the praises of a reconciliation bill that we really like a lot of the provisions in as much as we want, but if we're talking to a member of the minority party about a reconciliation bill, they're not going to support it. And that's because, frankly, they're being boxed out of the process, and there's really not a lot of changes that they're going to be able to make. So with all of those things in mind, I'm going to hand it back over to Bob, who can say a few more words, and then we can open up the floor to questions.
Thank you, Zach, for that very informative presentation. I actually learned something, and I spent, a few years in Congress. I had no idea that the House Commerce Committee was the one that handled drinking water issues. And if you look back at the way the committees were formed literally 100 years ago, the House Commerce Committee, they had jurisdiction over drinking water. It wasn't until the 1970s when the Energy and Commerce Committee was created. Um, they would retain the jurisdiction they had over in the past. I know from having been through jurisdiction fights in Congress itself, they fight tooth and nail to hang on to where their issues are. So it actually cleared up why the Senate was so much more efficient in terms of talking about that issue than it was in the House. Let's open the webinar now to questions. You can use the chat feature to submit a question, and I'll read the question to the presenter. Or if you prefer, unmute yourself, state your name and company, and ask the question directly. Remember to remute yourself after you finish. So the floor is open to our participants. I know there's probably something in there that Zach could expound upon, or I certainly could give my thoughts as well too. If you'd like to, you can certainly write it down, or you can write it. Give everyone a minute to sort of think about it. Zach, one of the other things you were talking about was certainly all the discussions that we've had recently about changing basic processes in the Senate. Like you said, the filibuster. How likely are our members have to worry about any of that for Summit?
When it comes to any process that would change or amend the filibuster rules, as I said, the momentum around that issue has largely stalled. Changing the filibuster is not something that you can turn the clock back on. Once that happens, you're effectively giving up a lot of hope for bipartisanship on certain issues. You can't put that genie back in the bottle. We are never going to see a 60 vote threshold imposed again on nominations, for example. And so as a result, key members of the Democratic caucus have been very reluctant to make that change, knowing that in a few years, they could very easily be in the minority again. The odds of the filibuster being amended before Summit are pretty much zero, to be perfectly frank. And at least for now, it does seem like the push for that has stalled. There are a couple of key issues that we are keeping our eyes on with regards to the filibuster. Those are primarily focused around a pair of voting rights or voting changes bills that the Democrats have introduced, namely HR/S1 and HR/S4, which are the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, that's HR4, and the what they call the For the People Act, that's HR1. Both of these are large bills that would change certain parts of the elections process. A lot of Democrats have proposed that the filibuster be dropped to get those through. It doesn't really seem like, as of now, that's going to happen. But if key Democratic priorities are increasingly held up, that's when you could see the momentum for any sort of change pick up again. As when it comes to Summit, it's not something we need to worry about for now. But if a change does appear like it might be made, rest assured that NUCA membership will know, and we will make our opinion heard to our members of Congress.
And as well, just to make sure everyone's clear, because I know when you deal with this stuff every day like you and I do, the filibuster is only applicable to the Senate. It is a special Senate rule that's been in place, I think, for close to 150 years.
That's correct.
The House does not have a filibuster rule at all. Its rules are much more straightforward.
That's
You don't
correct.
want to.
Although interestingly enough, the House actually did for a brief period in the early 19th century.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Which some folks have pointed to as a precedent for not only amending the Senate filibuster to go back to what it used to be, but getting rid of it entirely. Like I said, very controversial suggestion. I think that, frankly, as bad as the bipartisanship in Washington is sometimes right now, I do think the situation would have to get much worse for us to see them actually move on getting rid of it, because it is kind of the nuclear option. So I do see a question in the chat. Are we going to be addressing getting people back to work during the summit? Excellent question. If your member of Congress sits on either of the labor committees, it's a great thing to bring up. Most of our talking points for Summit do focus on the infrastructure package, because that is kind of what's taking up all of the oxygen in the room right now in Washington. But that's a part of it. As we have frequently told folks in Congress when we're talking about these bills, you're not going to be able to meet the timelines that you're setting out for these projects if folks in the industry don't have people to do the work. So it's something that we're going to talk about a little more next week in our issues briefing. But again, tying it back to what we talked about today, perfect example of tailoring what you're talking about to your audience. If your member of Congress is only on education and labor, then that's what you should plan on talking the most about.
And as well, too, it goes to the point that we mentioned in last week's summit, is that the members of Congress, they're politicians or legislators, so are their staff. This is what they do full time. What you do full time is run a business, and part of running a business includes dealing with your labor needs. These are exactly the kind of real world situations they want to hear. They want to actually hear from a business that operates in their district. I'd love to hire more people, but they're not coming back because they're making more being on unemployment than they are through a normal job like ours. It is those real world examples that really make an impression upon a member of Congress and their staffs as well, too. We in Washington, you get certainly encapsulated in the bubble of what happens around here, and you don't always think about what actually your policies that you came up with to help people may actually be hurting them instead, or certainly destroying their ability to actually make a living. But yeah, excellent question. And
hey, Zach.
Go on, please.
Driscoll Tubbs. Hey,
How you doing?
fine. The infrastructure bill. What are the chances that thing's going to stay the way it is with all this general crap involved in it that has nothing to do with infrastructure? Is that going to happen? Or is it going to go through the way they present it?
So I'm glad you asked that question. This is actually a perfect example of us seeing the process in action. So remember what I said about the executive branch. They spend months having their staff put together this beautiful budget proposal with all sorts of charts and numbers and spreadsheets saying exactly how they want to spend all the money. And then Congress says, thanks so much for this, and puts it on a pile and just kind of lets it gather dust. That's kind of where the Biden plan is at right now. The Biden infrastructure plan is really nothing more than a proposal until Congress actually sits down, writes legislation, and somebody introduces it. That bill, where we are in the process right now, it's not even there. There's no language. There's nothing introduced that has been designated as the vehicle for getting that through the process. It's really nothing more than an idea right now. So what we're hearing more and more might happen, especially as the administration starts to negotiate in good faith with Senate Republicans, is we may see a two-track approach where part of the bill, the stuff that everyone agrees is infrastructure and is necessary, and both parties want to see investment in, that stuff is going to be surface transportation, water infrastructure funding, broadband funding. After what happened last weekend, we may see some funding for critical infrastructure, cybersecurity. That will be negotiated and put together as a package that moves through regular order, and as such is subject to that 60-vote threshold. Everything else that they're not able to get bipartisan buy-in on, that would likely go through reconciliation. So that would move completely separate on a different timeline, probably after the bipartisan passage of another package, because if they do that first, it's going to be a lot less likely to be able to get folks on the other side of the aisle to want to come to the table. That is going to be where a lot of the stuff that isn't really considered infrastructure by folks on both sides of the aisle, that's where all that's going to go. What's significant about that is because it's moving through the reconciliation process, anything that's a policy change can't be included. And that's why I brought up the PRO Act, because the Biden plan specifically calls for its passage. But if they include that in a bill that's going through under the normal rules of procedure, subject to those 60 votes, it can't pass. And they can't include that in reconciliation because it's all policy changes. So for now, that bill is effectively stalled out. Does that make any sense?
Makes perfect sense. And so basically the media is getting people stirred up over nothing at this point. It's
Yeah,
not
we're
gonna
at the
go
point
through.
where everything is just being, you know, all the debate right now is just in the world of public opinion. Nothing has actually started in Congress with regards to a concrete package. But, you know, we at NUCA right now, we're focused in on the critical infrastructure, the stuff that we, know this country desperately needs. And for us, really, that's, water infrastructure, broadband, surface transportation, energy infrastructure, stuff that everybody on both sides of the aisle agrees is infrastructure and is critical infrastructure. And that's what we're likely to see move through as the first infrastructure package.
Zach, we have a question from the chat from our EDs. One of the things they're going to talk about with their meetings with their House and Senate, they're going to ask about considering immigration reform. Can you speak on that to where that may be right now?
So immigration reform is one of those topics that comes up every Congress, and it's very tricky to come to an agreement. Folks in Congress have very different opinions on what needs to be done with that. Right now, there's really not a whole lot of movement on immigration reform because, as I said earlier, all of the attention for once is actually focused on infrastructure. It does tie into the issues, particularly when we're talking about workforce development and workforce shortages. And so, again, if you're talking to somebody in the Education and Labor Committee, you can certainly mention it as something that you want to see addressed. As of now, beyond a few executive actions that the administration has taken regarding visas, refugee caps, and a couple of other program changes relating to the DACA program, as of now, we haven't really seen a whole lot of attention on the issue, but it's definitely something that is in the back of everyone's mind, particularly, again, as we talk about these workforce issues. So there's no reason not to bring it up to your member as something that you'd like to see addressed.
We have another question, and it's a logistical one, but I think it's very important. What should our dress attire be during our virtual meetings?
So my advice would be not to worry too much about that. It kind of depends on where you are. If you're in an office setting, wear what you usually wear to work. A collared shirt is always appreciated, be it a polo or a button-up, but it doesn't have to be super formal. If you're on the job site or you have the opportunity to take your meeting in front of a piece of equipment, something that you can use as use the setting to your advantage as a prop, since we are virtual, unfortunately, and not in Washington. Well, in that case, if you want to throw on a high-vis vest and a hard hat, I mean, that certainly doesn't help. No, it doesn't hurt making your case. It's really just, use your best judgment is what I would have to say, but you don't need to wear a suit and tie. You can throw on a jacket if you'd like, but you don't have to worry too much about being formal. At the end of the day, what's really important is that you just stress that you're a constituent and you're somebody that works in the industry, and the member of Congress is not really going to care as much about how you look. They're going to care more about what you have to say.
Yeah, absolutely. And if any of our members actually do the job site interview, which I hope somebody does, please make sure if you do it, you're not doing it around a running excavator. They can be incredibly noisy and it would drown out your message.
Yeah, that is a good point.
Yeah,
but if you do have a stationary excavator and you want to stand in front of it with a hard
Right.
hat and a high-vis vest, again, That would certainly help get your point across.
Right, and it's of course your choice where you want to do it. I remember some last year were done in boardrooms at the company headquarters. We have another one from one of our attendees. I'm going to read it out. We need critical infrastructure and need to revise our message for that. The rest of it just turns out to be fluff. Is there a way of getting that across to a member that really sort of like drives the point home in terms of we provide what real concrete and steel, and some of the other things that are being proposed or discussed aren't concrete and steel.
So we'll talk about this a little more next week in our issues briefing. But this process that is currently playing out in Washington may be to our advantage. If they do choose to split the Biden plan into two different vehicles, one being regular order, and the other being reconciliation, the one that goes to regular order almost has to be first. If they try to flip that process around and pass things that are a little more partisan, a little more controversial first, the things, again, that aren't necessarily traditionally considered infrastructure, if they pass that first, think about it from the perspective of the minority party, you're not really going to be in the mood to negotiate because you kind of just were locked out of the process. So if it moves to regular order first, well, that is going to be stuff that everyone agrees is critical infrastructure, which is the stuff that we frankly care the most about. So what we need to do in our meetings is just continue to remind members of Congress just how critical the needs are for this country's underground infrastructure. And frankly, most of this year has done a great job in making our case already. If there have been issues in your state, particularly for water service, and I'm talking to folks in Texas right now, especially, as well as anybody who might be in Mississippi, point to that. Point to the fact that folks in your town didn't have water for days due to outdated infrastructure. If we're talking about issues pertaining to energy, again, a lot of the folks in Texas can speak firsthand on the problems that happened this year. Folks all over the country, every single person in NUCA knows how dire the needs is. This is stuff that you all do every single day. And that is why Washington Summit, having you participate in the meetings, is so valuable, because you can tell the folks about the problems in their districts, in their states, stuff that you know firsthand. You can just essentially tell them that. All this other stuff, regardless of your opinion on it, can wait. But we can't wait any longer to address the critical infrastructure needs that are facing this country. And so that should be our priority, because it's something that right now everyone agrees on.
Very well stated, Zach. Absolutely. We're at 10 minutes till the hour. We want to make sure we're respectful of everyone's time. I don't see any other questions being asked, so I'll just go ahead and wrap it up. Zach, thank you very much for your time today to present this information to our members. Today's webinar will be recorded and will be made available on the WeDigAmerica.org website and NUCA's YouTube channel over the next few days. And thank you for your time today to join us for the opening Washington Summit webinars and supporting NUCA. Our next Summit webinar will be held next Wednesday, May 19th, and is titled Summit Congressional Briefing. The Congressional Briefing is a critical component of the Washington Summit. Eben and Zach and other top NUCA staff will update Summit attendees on the key legislative issues affecting our industry today. These issues are the ones Summit attendees will be discussing with their lawmakers, so please make sure you can make this webinar. Talking points, statistics, and important information will be shared during this briefing. Thank you for your time this afternoon, and please enjoy the rest of your week.